Mitch McConnell has introduced the Health Economic Assistance Liability Protection and Schools or HEALS Act Monday night after GOP negotiations came to a head on the next relief bill.
The $1 trillion proposal includes an extra $200 per week in unemployment insurance. That is down from the $600 provided back in the CARES Act. It also provides for a second $1,200 stimulus check. Washington Post economics reporter Jeffrey Stein joins us to discuss what provisions Democrats will look to change in the measure before that final package is passed, if it is in fact passed. Jeff, it's great to see you as always.
Hey, thanks for having me back on. It's a pleasure.
Good to see you, Jeff.
Of course. So break down what are the major provisions in this bill to start with.
So Mitch McConnell keeps talking about the bills consisting of help for schools, jobs, and healthcare.
Yeah.
And right now, the centerpiece of the bill, well, I guess there's a few main components. One is this UI provision you alluded to, dramatically cutting down unemployment benefits from $600 a week to $200 a week. And not only are they proposing a dramatic cut to unemployment insurance, they're also proposing a massive revamp of the unemployment insurance system. So currently, you get a $600 bonus from the federal government if you're on unemployment insurance, no matter what. That was approved by Congress in March. And what the Republicans are trying to do is to switch that system over to what's called a wage replacement system, in which the new system would give you 70% of your prior earnings. That is going to be very, very complicated to do for all sorts of reasons we can get into. And separately, they're also including over $100 billion for schools so they can reopen safely. That's even more money than Democrats have called for. Another $1,200 stimulus check, which they're looking for as basically a way to offset the decline in unemployment insurance. A liability shield, which would basically mean that if someone gets sick on the job and gets COVID, that they could basically not sue their employer for not doing enough to protect them, or at least mitigate the ability to sue. And then there are all sorts of other provisions. An FBI building renovation for $2 billion that President Trump wants. Some money for housing assistance. This thing is huge, and we're still just going through the details on all it consists of.
Yeah, and so, Jeff, let's talk about the realisticness of actually passing this, right? I mean, look, this thing is not going to pass as is. There's absolutely no way. What has been the response yet so far from Schumer and from Pelosi? What do you expect the major sticking points to be? Because earlier, whenever we talked, there are no red lines, as we have seen from Congressional Progressive Caucus, from Democratic leadership, and others. So what's going on here?
So, I mean, Democrats, Schumer and Pelosi have been very clear that they want to maintain that $600 per week unemployment benefit. But I think I reported a couple months ago that some Democrats on the Senate Finance Committee, which is responsible for writing the unemployment provisions and the tax laws for the country, have sort of said quietly that they are a little skeptical of the need to extend this at $600. They're hearing from business interests in their state. Democrats are a party that really reflects multiple different interests. It is a party in some degree of workers, and it is very, I think they would say that they're looking out for the unemployed more than Republicans are, but there are a lot of Democrats that listen very closely to the business interests and the small business interests in their states. And a lot of those businesses are telling them that they're having trouble rehiring workers. A lot of economists I talk to say that that's bunk, that many people are going, that basically everyone is going back if they can get a job, regardless of whether they're making more on unemployment, that people want to work if they can, if it's safe, and if the pay is adequate. But there are some Democrats who I think are quietly, very gently sort of opening the door to reducing the $600 per week benefit. And that's sort of giving people on the Hill some hope that there could be some form of a compromise here. But I think it's really worth pointing out that even if they cut the benefit down from $600 a week to $300 a week, that is a big cut to a source of economic stimulus. Consumption, spending in the economy in a sort of classical Keynesian sense has remained quite high despite all of the economic contraction we're seeing to the virus. And that's really due to the large federal influence, the federal infusion of money. And if that goes away, even at a slightly reduced level from Republicans are pushing for, we could be seeing economic contraction that could be really, really dangerous and devastating.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying it's possible Democrats will decide to go along with that provision ultimately. What about the lack of funds for state and local governments?
I think that's an area where I have some reporting that Mitch McConnell has sort of indicated maybe not him personally, but people close to him or his office, that they kind of understand that there's a need to get state and local money in there. I think one thing that I kind of missed when I first saw McConnell's bill, and I think a lot of people who aren't following it that closely miss, is that McConnell's position, I think, especially if you're on the left, it looks so conservative and right wing compared to some of the needs that people on the left and in the more mainstream media are talking about as necessary. But McConnell's position is kind of a consensus position within the Republican Party. Some Republicans not only don't want more state and local money, they don't want any flexibility for the state and local money that's already been approved. And so McConnell is saying we should at least provide more flexibility around that money, and then sort of quietly signaling if this is something Republicans will be willing to compromise on. There are things that I think Republicans would not be willing to compromise on, including something that I've written a lot about because it seems so important but never gets any attention, which is this issue that even though people on unemployment have been getting compensated quite well in some cases, essential workers, people who are on the front lines, people who have been risking their lives for months, have really seen no additional federal help. Often working minimum wage jobs, they can't go on unemployment because if they did lose their jobs, their employers could tell the state unemployment system that they quit and they would be ineligible. And so this is, I think, one of those huge issues where even if you're, a bleeding heart liberal and you say, I really think that the unemployment insurance is really important, we need to extend it at all costs. What do you say to someone who's making minimum wage, really not even a living wage, who's been bagging groceries or is a nursing assistant, and they just worked through this pandemic for months without any additional compensation from the federal government? And I'll just point out, President Trump has said that he wants hazard pay for frontline workers,
right,
and yet has done absolutely nothing to make that happen.
So this is the fascinating part to me, Jeff. You're right. Trump has said that. Mitt Romney even proposed, Patriot pay, all of that. Yeah. I haven't seen it go anywhere. Let's talk about this, which is why is the White House just seem to be, I wouldn't call it irrelevant, but they almost seem to be, a secondary player in much of these negotiations. It seems to me that the conservative, and what I mean by that is the economically, more libertarian-minded Republican senators are the ones who are in the driver's seat here.
That's a really great point, and I think reflects some of the insight that you personally bring to
Thank you.
Conservative circles. I think a lot of people miss about sort of this emerging division. I mean, I think it's true that the sort of more establishment, business-friendly conservatives compared to, I don't know what you would call it, like economic nationalists, more economic populist style conservatives have been in the driver's seat, but there are ways in which even the more nationalist side of the Republican Party has won. Lindsey Graham, for instance, who traditionally has been considered more of an establishment business type Republican, secured a provision in the McConnell bill that would incentivize onshoring of domestic supply chains, which would be a big deal in terms of the economic nationalists wanting to move supply chains from China to the U.S. The stimulus payments, $1,200 per person, that's not a traditional conservative Republican idea, and that's in there. So, I mean, then again, you look at Larry Kudlow winning basically on this demand for an expansion of meals deductions. For those who don't know, the Republican bill proposes a 100% deduction. Basically, corporations can offset their tax burden if they send their employees to restaurants and to baseball games, which frankly can't even open safely without fans at this point. So it's a really interesting tension, and I think you can definitely, I think if you're on one side, you think you're losing, but it might be a little more, I think there's a fusion at some level going on there.
Jeff, finally, can you speak to the situation with housing? We know that Kudlow has indicated they want to lengthen the eviction moratorium. That would be for homeowners who have a federally backed mortgage product. What about for renters? What is the situation looking like come here August 1st?
God, that's such an important question. It's been a little frustrating to cover. Larry Kudlow on Sunday told CNN that he was for extending the eviction moratorium. That struck me as a huge deal when I saw it. That's 12 million people who would be shielded from eviction.
Right.
Democrats report that if the White House did, it would be very likely to pass, or much more likely to pass. Then Kudlow on Monday seemed to backtrack and say that he had misspoken essentially, and that he was actually talking about forbearance for homeowners and FHA-backed properties. totally different thing. And so I still have not been able to get clarity. I have not seen that Republicans have proposed that. I would be surprised if they did. It seems like it's out of the bill. And it's one of those things that you look down the list of all of the things Democrats that Democrats want that are not in the Republican bill, and which of these get through. Democrats say that they need funding for the Postal Service to survive. They need funding for elections to make sure that the elections in November are safe given the pandemic. They need money to get the unemployment boost up. They need money for essential workers to have hazard pay. And so does something like the eviction moratorium get left on the table because there are all these other things Democrats have to bargain for? I think it's a very dangerous question.
Yeah, certainly is. Thank you, Jeff, for keeping us updated. Appreciate it very much.
Thanks so much. See you guys soon, hopefully.
Mm-hmm.
Next on Rising, friend of the show, Matt Taibbi, is going to discuss the media coverage of 2016 and 2020 and whether gender has played a role in the dynamics thus far when Rising continues.